Welcome to another episode of Beyond COVID-19. Today I have a special guest with us, Ewuare Osayande. He is a poet, a published author, and he is also an anti-racism educator and advocate. I just want to go over what we'll be discussing today. We're going to talk about COVID-19 and the effects that it has on Black Americans, and then beyond COVID-19, but we'll also talk about some of the factors that have been taking place prior to the health virus that is now heightening the reasons why African Americans are dying at higher rates and why they're being affected by it mostly. So before we begin, Ewuare, can you introduce yourself and give the audience a little bit more information about who you are and what is it that you do?
Well, first, Kearney, thank you for the opportunity to share with you and your audience. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you.
And I would say that in addition to what you said, I'm a father of two sons. My youngest son is about to graduate college at Temple University, so we're terribly proud of that. Yeah, just that I'm somebody that is very concerned about the circumstances in our community, in our world, and have lived my life trying to both learn about those conditions and to also address those conditions to increase justice in our society as best I can.
You know, I had a planned, outlined conversation that I wanted to have, but you know, there's just so much to talk about with the topic of structural racism, PTSD, adultification, and all of the systems that are affected in America by the structural racism, with one being the healthcare system. I would list some systems that affect our daily lives, but I think we'll begin with the healthcare system because that's where we are right now. So some of the systems that I feel that are kind of grouped together that affect African American lives are the healthcare system, the education system, the political system, the legal system, arts and entertainment, media and communication, and religion. And within all of those systems, there are tremendous disparities that affect our lives. And the reason behind those disparities are not by accident. That's exactly what structural racism is. It's laws and policies and procedures that have been purposely created out of white supremacy. And before we begin with the healthcare system and structural racism, I think we have to break down what white supremacy is, or understand those words and define them. So white supremacy is the belief that white people are superior than other races, and that therefore they dominate those people in society. Is that correct?
No, that's absolutely correct. I mean, I would only add to that whiteness itself, that race itself is not a biological reality, right? There's only one race, that's the human race. But with respect to what we understand as race, we're dealing with a social construct that was developed as a consequence of colonialism, European colonialism. And it was a construct that was devised and established by Europeans for the specific purpose, as you said, of maintaining power and authority. And the social structure, the economic structure, the reality of slavery, the devastation and genocide of indigenous peoples in the Americas are but consequences of that fundamental idea and conception. And so, yes, but to your point, the realities that Black folks in this country experience today is a definite consequence of that fundamental construction that continues to live in our society even now.
Let's talk about the healthcare system and the disparities within healthcare, whether we as African Americans are educated, whether we live in the suburbs or the city, drive fancy cars or not, it doesn't matter. We face disparities in a lot of aspects in life, and the healthcare system is definitely one of those systems that causes it to be a life or death matter with us. I have my own experiences with unsatisfactory level of treatment with family members in the hospital. As a caregiver, that's one of the things that the unions are fighting for, because they know that statistically Black and brown people are treated differently based on implicit bias.
Yes, yes.
Can you talk to that?
Yes, absolutely. And just for the audience's awareness, I'm going to at least contextualize my comments in the current reality of the coronavirus that we're facing. But yes, I mean, we can speak about, just a long legacy of both the structural racism that has occurred upon Black people with respect to outright medical experimentation, that has left a legacy of distrust with respect to Black folks and the medical institutions in our society. But even more recently, even as we witness, what's occurring, let's remember back when the COVID-19 first kind of hit the country, and the general attitude among a lot of Black folks was, this isn't going to affect us. Somehow, whether it's all these different myths were popping up, rumors being spread, somehow our melanin was going to fight the virus and things like that. And then, of course, we know what occurred. We've been devastated. This thing is really wreaking havoc on our communities. And to your point, Sister Kearney, whether we're talking about the most impoverished neighborhoods, or, I just read a headline the other day indicating that Prince George's County, what is known as the most wealthy,
Maryland,
in Maryland, is being devastated by this virus as well. And so what that says to us is that we have a fundamental problem with the healthcare industry. Black people do not have a genetic disposition to the coronavirus. What we have is a generational disposition to a discrimination that has impacted our community at a rate that has weakened our immune system, our social and communal immune system, to fight this kind of attack on our people. And so, we can talk about, I would say that there are at least 3 levels of concern in healthcare. The first is that, as we know, a lot of our folks don't have adequate access to healthcare, that the healthcare system, that there are too many gaps and holes in the structure itself, that a lot of our people fall through the cracks, not able to get healthcare because we don't have, full employment. We don't have gainful employment. And so we rely on coming out of our pocket, hope that we don't have an emergency, that kind of thing. And so we don't have that relationship with a primary care physician, right? And so that's one layer. And then even those of us that do have that relationship with a primary care doctor, or at least have adequate health care, that in the event of an emergency, we can go to the hospital and at least know that we're going to get a bed, that we're going to get a nurse, we're going to get somebody to come in and look at us. That even in those circumstances, there have been studies that have shown that, that as you spoke to, this medical bias tends to show up most with respect to how we are treated. If there's a tendency to view Black people as somehow being able to withstand more pain than others, crazy things, crazy ideas, but all of these ideas, again, have their roots in slavery and the stereotypes and mythologies that were concocted not to speak truth to the Black experience, but to justify the oppression, the torture that Black folk experience at the hands of white oppressors during slavery. And so I would say then on top of that is a third level of concern is that disproportionately, and you would be able to speak most of this given the work that you do, is that disproportionately a high number of nurses and aides and custodians are Black.
A lot of the essential workers are Black and brown.
That's right.
They currently are fighting for PPE.
Yes.
Some of my fellow caregivers and home care workers right now, particularly in the nursing homes, are fighting and struggling because aides are dying, patients are dying. The nursing home owners are not providing PPE. They're not paying paid sick time for when the caregivers are exposed to the virus and they have to quarantine. Now they're home. They're home with children. They don't have childcare. So right now the unions are fighting for childcare, essential pay, PPE. Some nursing homes, the workers are wearing trash bags. They are trying to find anything that they can protect themselves from, and many people have loved ones in the nursing homes, and then also the patients are being diagnosed with coronavirus, and it's a secret. They're not sharing with family members, and they're not sharing with the workers who are working with them every day.
Every day.
So on top of that, then you have where there was a lack of testing for us. Even I think I read today where there was a nurse, African-American nurse, who requested to get tested 4 times. I don't have her name, but she requested to get tested 4 times, and she passed away. So we're not getting tested. Like you said, there hasn't been enough research on why some of these things are happening. And we can look back to history and then apply it to what's going on right now and why it's amplified at this very moment.
So true. Yes. No, thank you.
Moving beyond COVID-19, with some of the disparities that we face on a daily basis, housing, right? Housing and gentrification and banking and finance. That's a reason why many of us, some of us who live in densely populated communities, are being affected at a higher rate as well. But there's a reason why many African Americans are living in densely populated communities. Can you speak to the banking and finance and then the housing that encompasses all of that, and why we're being affected again because of our housing situation?
Yes, absolutely. There are, well, I think that the first place to start with a conversation on housing discrimination is in the legacy and history of redlining. Redlining was a process by which banks and real estate companies kind of joined together to ensure that to appease the white supremacy of your average white American family, talking about now going back into the 1930s, into the 40s, into the 50s. 50s, as we recall, the American narrative of nostalgia, of the development of what we now understand as the suburbs. These new homes were being developed all across the country. And there was also a level of upward mobility in the African-American community that for that time was unprecedented. You had a lot of African-Americans returning from the wars of that period. And because of those that were able to access the GI Bill, they were able to get loans for homes. And so you have this new class coming up, and they are attempting to, do what all the other Americans are trying to do, have a family, establish their lives. And these banks and real estate companies join forces to literally draw that's why it's called redlining. They went and got local maps and began to draw lines around the communities to say, we are not going to sell homes to Black families inside these particular communities. And so that led to the ostracization and the marginalization of Black families into what today would be considered more lower income working class communities. And as a consequence, and in certain cases, and we saw this more recently with the economic crisis back in 2008. That economic crisis occurred on the backs of Black families that were given these predatory loans. that at the front end, they were told that these loans were fixed, that the rates would not vary. And then as soon as they got into, signing those loans in a few years, then all of a sudden now the rates began to shift and they were no longer able to keep up. And so they would have to foreclose on those homes. That led to the 2008 crash in a lot of ways. So on both ends, we have Black families being taken advantage of by a real estate industry, a housing industry in this country. And as you said, as a consequence, a lot of Black families end up having to rent where they live, end up having to live in communities where they don't have the benefit and privilege. See, this is important to appreciate, the privilege of social distancing. Mm-hmm. So going back to what we talked about with respect to, say, our nurses, our aides, and even some of our doctors, when they are in the hospitals that are not being properly prepped with respect to PPE, they return home. Unlike a lot of their white counterparts, they are returning to homes where they don't have the ability to say, I'm going to stay in this room, or I'm going to stay in this section of the house, or I'm going to stay in the basement, or I'm going to go stay in the shed. Mm-hmm. We don't have that access to space like that for many of us, not all of us, but for many of us. And so, again, these things lead us to a realization that our underlying condition as a community is structural racism. And that's a word that African Americans in particular, we really need to understand and appreciate, because it truly indicates, it creates the barriers on our life possibilities, or at least creates barriers that we have to somehow find new ways to overcome.
And I think it's also important to note that those of us who make a good amount of salary, and we want to move into different areas, upward mobility, sometimes, unfortunately for us, we might have to work 3 times as hard to get into the same neighborhood that someone white is in and doesn't have an equal rate of pay, type of occupation. There's a disparity again, that we can't get the loans continuing into today to move into certain neighborhoods. So we go to where it's affordable and where the banking and loans will be available to us.
That's right.
Then with the education system, that's affected right now because children are home. Our schools, many of them, unfortunately, operate at a subpar level. And then when you have the coronavirus, many of our families don't have access to the internet.
That's right.
Don't have computers at home. And I know that some districts are providing computers for the families. I do understand that. But at the same time, you still have people who don't have internet, don't have the access to those things. And they pull the money out of our public schools to go to the charter schools. And then, unfortunately, charter schools may look good on the outside, but they're not really presenting great academic findings at the end of the day.
I say that the charter schools are a Band-Aid on the cancer. And the cancer being, our public education system. And again, I want to really highlight the connection. So we just talked about housing. Mm-hmm. In most states in this country, public education is funded primarily on property taxes. Mm-hmm. And so in communities where African Americans predominate, again, as a consequence of the conversation we just had about housing discrimination, those communities tend to be where folks are renting as opposed to owning. And so that tax base is a lot smaller with respect to the outlying counties that surround most cities. And so as a consequence, those particular schools are going to be funded poorly. Then you have the additional problem where, say for example, where I live in Philadelphia, Philadelphia is a city in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is, it tends to be a pretty red state. Mm-hmm. And the governor and the state apparatus tend to not look favorably on cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And so, yet given the discriminatory way in which schools are funded, city operations have to appeal to the state then to make up for the funds that they don't have. Mm-hmm. And states have been slow, of course, and lax in providing the support that's needed, such that cities have to come up with different taxes on drinks and cigarettes and the like to try to compensate for the funding. Now, there's a larger conversation there that we can have about, holding the corporations that exist in the city accountable to help provide that funding. But not necessarily what we're trying to have that kind of conversation today. But to your point, yes, this and with respect to the current coronavirus crisis that we're living in, of course we know that there's this push now to reopen the economy, and not even talking about the health crisis that will be compounded if that happens under the current circumstances. But imagine those of us who are parents, who have children, where the economy opens up before the schools return. And now you're faced with a choice, like, how do I, go back to work, and I got to provide for my kid, and the kid can't go to school, and so it creates these dilemmas that, again, the wealthier you are, you can just say, okay, I'm going to have a babysitter, I'm going to, hire a sitter, I'm going to, take my kids to the special daycare where they can go and have fun and not be concerned about these things. For most of us, we don't have that luxury. Mm-hmm. And so again, what this is doing, I'm hoping that your listeners, your viewers, are able to begin to help us make the connections. That there is a literal web, if you will, that has cast itself over our community, and it's been there. It's been there. It's only now that this emergency environment is forcing us to come to terms with it.
And that's the purpose of me wanting to have this discussion, is because prior to the health crisis, like you said, we know that there have been disparities in society, and we know that they were conscious decisions to put in place policies, laws to keep Black people oppressed. Neighborhoods, access to food, access to healthcare, education, the criminal justice system, which, it's there are still police brutality that's going on during this health crisis. Mm-hmm. I want to get back to the healthcare for a second and talk about the health issues within our communities.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay, we do know that many people in our community suffer with health conditions. Right. However, at the same time, depending on where you live, like for me, for example, I live in what would be considered a food desert. I have a car, I can get out and go. So I have to drive and travel to the grocery store. There are grocery stores in this area, but in the smaller portion of where I live, it's very difficult to get quality food. Yeah. It's easy to get junk food, McDonald's or something like that, or soul food or something like that. But quality groceries, you have to get in the car and drive. And if you don't have a car, it's hard to get groceries. Even if the bus ride is 10 minutes away, you still cannot drive there.
Yes. No, I think you said it all. And as a consequence, our community suffers from higher rates of diabetes, high blood pressure, as a consequence of our diet. That is because, right, particularly when we're younger, we're going to be socialized into a diet that is about what's accessible. And as you said, if the McDonald's is on the corner, if the Crown Chicken is on the corner, those are going to be the mainstays of our diet if we have to get in a car to go and get some fresh vegetables and fruit. And for some of us that don't have those vehicles and don't have that kind of access, we have to see these as acts of discrimination and organize ourselves as a community, not around who we're going to vote next into office. That's important. But in addition to that, we have to organize ourselves around these issues so that when whoever gets in office, we say, all right, these are our needs. This is what we believe not believe. This is what we understand that we need in order to live meaningful lives, in order to raise our kids well, in order to, sustain ourselves and not be a burden on the healthcare system. And until we do that, the onus ultimately is on us as a community. And, I'm really hoping that this current moment is really casting a light on our needs in a manner that is causing us as a community to kind of wake up and say, okay, here we are. What do we need to do to pull this together right?
Why do you think there has been maybe a complacent mindset with some of us within the African American community with regards to issues that we face? I see sometimes in certain stores where most of the essential places or stores that are located where I live, no one looks like me in the general population. There are stores that we own, but for the most part, we don't own gas stations, the grocery stores, things like that. And then a lot of times you're not treated very well by the store owners. You're not treated well. Sometimes you're followed around. You're talked to in a disrespectful manner. And for me, I get upset and I don't want to go back there. I'll take my dollars someplace else and I won't support you. And we spend approximately $1.3 trillion that we give to the economy based on our spending habits, our influence. Brands want to target us because they know that there is power behind what they call the Black dollar.
That's right.
What will it take, if not this coronavirus, what will it take to wake us up and say, I think there's a movement now, and I see some of the noted leaders on television have been talking about we save us. What will it take for us to save us?
Yeah.
Because we are fighting against a system that was never designed for us. And it is a matter of life and death, literally, life and death.
That's right. No, thank you. I think that, I want to just double down on your last comment there, that this is a matter of life and death. We are no more than 12 to 13% of the American population, and yet are in some of these locations, Chicago, New York, New Orleans, even in some of the more, not so predominant African-American spaces in Virginia, even in certain parts of the South, Midwest, there was a whole set of articles that showed up maybe about a little less than a month ago in Milwaukee, and the impact of the coronavirus was having on us, the deadly impact it was having on our community there. We cannot allow this moment to pass by without taking a long, deep look at our condition in this country right now. I have tremendous respect for a lot of the folks who are on the television, on CNN, MSNBC, and these other programs, really attempting to call attention to this. What I also know is that I'm a student of Black movements. And what those movements teach me that although there was always some kind of titular figurehead, Dr. King and Malcolm X, et cetera, but that the nexus of the movement was always centered in working class Black communities. Those folk that, really were on the front lines of this reality. And we live in a time today where, those families are really stretched. I don't think it's a matter of us not caring. I think we care very, very much. But the circumstances under which we live make it very difficult for us these days to kind of organize the way that we're used to seeing organization occur. And then, of course, there's social media, And so that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think that what we learned from, say, the Black Lives Matter movement, which is, as you recall, right before those marches began, a lot of people, particularly, from my age and a little older, were kind of writing off this generation, saying, folks aren't being interested in social justice issues anymore. And then Michael Brown was murdered, Trayvon Martin was murdered. And then we saw this upsurge of movements, thousands of us just taking to the streets, just based off of somebody posting something on social media.
And I went down to Missouri after the Michael Brown shooting. It just struck me. I had everything that was going on. I just thought, oh my gosh, I have to go down there. And it was actually beautiful because I visited the site in the street where he was shot, where they had the memorial, and there were so many people from all over, not just from the US, from other countries, backgrounds. I mean, it really was a beautiful thing. I did not realize how his shooting impacted the world. I was shocked to see people from different countries gathered at his memorial.
Yeah. So again, I would say that it's that we have to use this time to kind of rethink our approach, to reimagine what movement looks like for us now. I know there are a lot of different organizations that are, on the ground trying to do that essential work. And for those of us that can't get out and support that, or certainly this virus is challenging our ability to organize, just to be in each other's company. But we have to find new ways to get together. And just, I would say for myself, my word is that we have to educate ourselves right now. Let's use this quarantine time to educate ourselves, to learn about our history, to learn about the struggles of the past, to educate ourselves on these conditions that you and I are having a conversation on. And with an eye toward, we got to figure this out, because what we know is that whenever we go back to normal, it's not going to be the way things have been. We don't know what tomorrow's going to look like in this country. And, by evidence, by those that are on the other side of the political spectrum, those folk really don't care about us, they don't care about us, and let them tell it, they would like to see us taken out by this virus. And so, that the theme that, we got, if not us, who, these are good ideas, but we have to back them up with program. And I would say that needs to begin locally. And as we begin locally, we connect up with each other in our various communities, because we're all facing the same conditions wherever we are. It might look a little different, might be nuanced a little bit, but ultimately we're all facing the same problem.
And I think it's important that this is not a time to be scared.
Right.
A lot of times, those of us who have been subjected to racist behaviors, we don't speak up, we don't talk about it. And I understand why. Retaliation, and you have a livelihood, you have family. But that's the whole idea. So that you don't speak up. That is threats, you know, it's harassment, it's retaliation. I myself, and I won't go all into it, but I have experienced racism in the workforce, 2 different locations. And it took a lot of courage for me to stand up and to understand what the consequences might have been for me to speak up against what happened to me.
Yeah.
And the reason why I decided to speak up is I was looking at people after me. Who's coming in after me? What are they going to have to experience? Why do I have to make this choice? Why does that choice exist? Why do I have to think, do I speak up against behavior that is offensive and threatening to me? Or do I worry, or do I just go on about it so I can keep my job, keep making my money, and just have a happy life? Yeah. Why is that decision there? And this is something we need to talk about, just keep it real. Why is that decision there? That when we experience disrespectful and racist behaviors, why do we have to decide whether or not we're going to speak up about it? Yeah. That should not exist. And I just want to look at one of the comments. Desire says, I have, let's see. She's had the worst bedside manner from doctors, no eye contact, not believing her fully when describing her symptoms. It's terrifying, honestly. She goes to Philly just to find doctors who are more comfortable with diversity. Desire, you are not alone. Yes. There are many people who feel just as you feel. Absolutely. I'll share a story about one of my experiences with my mother. My mother was a cancer patient, and I was out of town while she was sick. And family members were calling me. They had to take her to the hospital. And the staff doctor who was, well, I don't know what you call the proper term, but the one that's the ER doctor was who was on staff that night, refused to give my mother an IV. I've never heard of you going to an emergency room and not getting an IV. I am across the country in Kansas City. My mother is in Pennsylvania. She is in the ER and they will not give her an IV. My family members were calling me. They won't hook her up. They won't hook her up to IV. The doctor had to prove that I was her daughter, that I was the power of attorney. Here she was with her sister, cousins, friends in the ER. I'm her daughter on the phone telling her I'm her power of attorney. I have power of attorney papers. Do you know my family members had to leave that hospital room, go to the attorney's office? Luckily, the attorney was in the same area, and try to get the power of attorney papers. However, before they returned, because I just made so much mess about it, you know, another doctor came on the line, called me and said, listen, we're going to hook her up. Don't worry, we're going to get her set. So can you imagine the thought of me being across the country, feeling powerless? I felt powerless too many times as a result of care or the lack thereof with a loved one in the hospital. And I have to be honest, when people started dying, I was terrified. I was more terrified. I wasn't terrified of the coronavirus. I was terrified of having to go into the hospital without an advocate. Yes. That was my true concern. Not if I catch coronavirus. Right. Not about that. No, it was, I do not want to go into the hospital alone without an advocate. So Desire, I understand exactly where you're what you're speaking about, and I'm just passionate about this. You know, with the union that I belong to, that's one of my concerns is racial justice and transformation within the healthcare system, particularly now that we were in this healthcare crisis. And that's why this segment is titled Beyond COVID-19, because I want to discuss what we're going through now, but then how are we going to live after this is over? If we can't come together and really think about long and hard our history, the disparities in these systems, how we were affected before this virus, how this virus has affected us. If we can't figure all that out and moving forward, I don't know where we'll be. And this is a real conversation that we're having.
Absolutely.
Because these are real issues that are affecting our community. I want to talk about, we brought up implicit bias. And Desire talked about the doctors not believing her when she goes to the hospital. And you brought up the of not believing us when we're in pain. And do you think that has anything to do with why the opioid issues, why that has affected others more so than African Americans, and why there is a different type of response to that epidemic?
Oh, absolutely. You know, generally speaking, when it comes to any type of drug, you know, there is this attitude that, African Americans are both the users and the dealers, right? And the way in which that narrative gets played out in our country is in a way that criminalizes Black people as a consequence. I mean, I think, you know, just on that point, it astounded me when, you know, the nation finally began to have conversation about decriminalizing marijuana usage. And, you know, you had all these men and women behind bars for trafficking in marijuana and dealing, et cetera, as businesses were opening up, you know, selling medical marijuana, et cetera. Not just the contradiction, but again, the inherent injustice in the way in which this country consistently responds to Black folks is outstanding at an absurd level. What you shared about this particular concern is it's just, you know, for me, it just follows the trajectory of our experiences. You know, if there's any care and concern given to people who have addiction, all of the funds, all of the resources are going to go to white communities. And, you know, as we're experiencing here, Black folks are just going to be left to fend for themselves. And what is worse, many of us saw the recent video footage of the young African-American man wielding a bat in the store. It astounds me. It frustrates me to no end to witness personnel who are trained. Let's get this clear. No officer wearing a badge is going to get that badge without going through the academy. In the academy, they teach officers how to respond to certain persons where they are showing signs of mental problems. Let's say that. Yet, consistently, we see police officers respond to Black folks showing clear mental issues with gunfire, with deadly gunfire. And that's what occurred. You know, there is a level of you know, I get it. This is all very overwhelming for folks who are already in our own personal lives overwhelmed. And yet here we are. And so, you know, part of the work, as you know, indicated by the title of your organization, we have to learn how to care for ourselves. We have to learn how to care for each other. We got to love on ourselves. We got to love on each other, and then allow that love to germinate at such a rate and level that it causes us to, as you said in your own experience, to get to the point where you said, I can't take this anymore, right? We all got to have our Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer moments where it's like, I've had enough of this. I am sick and tired of being sick and tired. And when that moment comes, when that passion strikes within us, that, you know, as some of us from the church might say, when the Spirit moves, you know, that's when change occurs. That's when our reality gets better. And sadly, not before then, because the structures are arrayed in such a way that they are dependent on our submission. We saw that recently with you know, white folks, the majority white folks with their flags and Confederate paraphernalia in the streets, talking about they want to go back to work so that they can go to the hair salon and get the gray out their hair and get a haircut and all that's nonsense. You know, what you noticed in some of those cases, and a lot of those folks were holding up signs talking about, you know, they had small businesses, right? As you were talking about, when you go down the block and you go into Main Street in a lot of our communities, those businesses are not owned by us. They're not even owned by other people of color. They're owned largely by white folks from the suburbs who employ our folks. It's not them so much whose lives are going to be put at risk. Even in that movement, the people that they are calling for to go back to work are largely Black and brown folks, the people that take care of their kids, people that take care of their lawns, people that you know, clean out their facilities, etc. You know, we are in a historic moment. We've actually been living in that historic moment ever since the election of Barack Obama. And what we have to understand and appreciate with respect to Trump's presidency is Trump's presidency it wasn't about, we can get angry at Trump, and we have plenty of reason to get angry at Trump. Man's a fool. But more importantly is we have to take a step back and recognize when we see Trump, we have to see all those folks that voted for him. And they voted for him as a protest, get this, as a protest vote to the Obama presidency. And we have to see the Obama presidency not as a Black man and that Black wife in Michelle Obama. We have to see the Obama presidency as the upsurge of democracy in the movement of Black people and that record turnout. That was the closest we've come as a country to democracy. And what we're witnessing now, the way that in that midterm election where they robbed the votes in Georgia, got that fool in the office, where they robbed the votes in Florida, got that fool in the office. Notice who the governors are that are calling for us to go back to businesses as normal. And let's recall how they got to office. They got it by stealing votes, by trafficking in all manner of cheatery. Make up I'm a poet, I can do that. You know, these are the folks that are creating greater havoc for our communities today. And I don't think that's by mistake whatsoever.
Before my grandmother passed away, this was during the beginning of Trump's election. And, you know, there was Trayvon Martin, there was just so much going on. And then his rallies and just so much violence and police brutality that was being shown across the screen. And at the time, my grandmother was, I don't know, maybe 86, 87. And I said, Mama, you know, what do you think is going on right now? Do you know what she said? Her response, 2 words, Jim Crow.
Our elders, boy, they know the deal.
Crow.
Yes.
Is what my grandmother, my 86-year-old or 87-year-old grandmother said when I asked her, what do you think is going on right now? This was in the beginning. She passed away. She didn't even live to see him. What has been going on in the last, 3,
Yes.
4 years, last 4 years.
That's right.
She hasn't even seen it. She just she got a glimpse of what was taking place.
Yes.
And so now when you said democracy, all of that is being torn down.
Mm-hmm.
Voter suppression.
Yes.
You know, people, I know part of the union, we're trying to get people to register to mail in their absentee ballots because we saw what happened in Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
Shut down all those polling places, you know? So it is, again, we want everyone to know that this is structural. This is planned. This is purposely designed
Yes.
to keep people back.
That's right. That's right.
To keep people back. Now, I do want to talk about, you touched on the other system, criminal justice system, and then the legal system at the same time.
Sure.
I want to go back to the protests of opening up states and the cities and businesses. We saw some people with the Confederate flags. We saw people armed with guns and rifles. But at the same time, when Kaepernick was protesting police brutality and taking a knee,
Right.
he was unpatriotic.
Yeah.
There was all these negative terms thrown around at him.
Absolutely.
But yet we have certain people who can walk on governmental property in a military uniform with rifles.
That's right.
And Confederate flags. What does that have to do with opening up businesses?
Yeah.
I'm confused. I was confused.
Sure, right. No, it doesn't make any sense, of course. And of course, what we know is that it doesn't have to, right? It doesn't have to, you know, that the sense is made in the action of those that have, you know, just like we talk about our legacy, just like we honor our legacy. You know, you have Douglas's book there, you have Nikki Giovanni's poetry. We have a strong legacy of Black folks who have stood up, who have forged forward. You know, the people who have benefited from the structures of oppression. You know, they claim a legacy too. And that's a legacy of violence. It's a legacy of terrorism. That's a legacy of using state apparatus as a means to intimidate and control Black folks. And that's what they were demonstrating. We know that if that was us at the state capitol brandishing weapons, that would have been a wholesale slaughter. And yet, what that is a lesson for us. Not necessarily that we need one, but a reminder of the great disparity that exists, even with, as you said, to your point, with respect to Brother Kaepernick, demonstration of our right to protest. We take the most, you know, peaceful and nonviolent means, and yet our lives are still threatened, even when we do that. Whereas the folks that already benefit from the structures that are in place can go to the most violent demonstrate means and are celebrated, are you know, rolled out the red carpet with respect to law enforcement and how they are treated and how they are met. Yeah, this is again, it's a very telling moment. And just to point this out, I know that in our community, you know, depending on who you're speaking to, there's a hesitation for us to really stand up on behalf of those of our family members who are behind bars, those within our community who are behind bars. We still, you know, have to kind of come to terms with the whole morality question of the legal system. Our legal system is quite immoral. Our legal system is quite unjust. And that's not to say that everybody who's in prison doesn't deserve to be in prison or you know, is or isn't guilty. The issue is the system. And, there's something in our legal doctrine that talks about cruel and unusual punishment. Well, right now, whether we're talking about mass incarceration of African Americans, whether we're talking about the child detention centers along the borders of this country, the separation of families that has occurred, impacting largely the Latino, Latinx community. We are witnessing a health crisis even behind those walls, that our humanity compels us to say, hold on, we need to make sure that those folks are being taken care of, because whether we want to believe it or not, that is also going to impact even us outside those walls. There is, again, so much for us to be concerned for at this time. I'm all down for, the club quarantine events and listening to music and just joining in community with each other. All that's important. At the same time, we also have to become more concerned about the reality that we are facing. Let us not find ourselves dancing ourselves into, the proverbial doomsday that awaits us.
You brought up a topic that I actually want to move into, and that's the media and communication system, which controls the images that we see on television or social media. And I want to ask you, it doesn't matter where we are in life as African Americans, because through the eyes of white supremacy, we're viewed the same.
Yeah.
Whether or not you're in a suit or a jogging suit, you're in an old car or a fancy car, we're viewed the same. However, when we talk about We Save Us, moving forward beyond COVID-19, there is an issue within our communities where we want to continue to one-up each other. I see this on social media where people put other people down because of them being broke, or if it's a female, someone being called an old whatever.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter in the larger scheme what we have. The fight is not against each other. It is against the system. Yeah. So where does that mind frame? And I know this, it is programming.
Sure.
It's programming. We don't just wake up and we're like that. There is a history of programming behind thought processes, which is also planned. We are not controlling these media companies, and I don't have anything against them. I'm just saying that for us, we are not seeing a lot of times a lot of positivity, whether it's locally on the news or even in our television programming during prime time.
That's right.
And then on social media, we're calling each other names.
Yeah.
And saying somebody is broke, or and it's just, there's so much more that we need to come together to fix.
Definitely.
So that we can move beyond the COVID-19. Where does that mindset, I want to talk about that mindset. Where does that mindset come from, that colorism, that one-upping each other? Let's talk about that.
Thank you. Everything you're speaking to points us back to what I understand as the overriding drive of the economic system that we live in. The capitalist system under which we live places our value on how much we have in our bank accounts. And given the discrimination of our community that has largely been an economy that has exploited our labor and cheated us with respect to payment of our labor. And this goes all the way back, of course, to slavery, sharecropping, both the racial and gender discrimination that is faced in the workplace where the average Black person, the average Black woman makes sense on the dollar with respect to white folks. These dynamics play out in our community in such a way that although this is the reality, and one would think that we would be organized against it, recognizing that our economic condition is often a consequence not due to our work ethic, hardest working folks. Okay, the whole economy was literally built on our backs, on our babies.
That's a narrative that we need to change for when we're caught lazy and don't want to work. I don't even know how that even
how people can fix their face to even come out like that. Exactly, yes. And so you're right, though. We have to do a better job, programs where they are, calling out the worst aspects of us, parading, putting up video clips of Black folks and then mocking those Black people for, exhibiting whatever behavior, however. We have to take a stand and say, hold on, that's not good. Because my question is, if it were a white person, would we celebrate that? And if we wouldn't, then why do we celebrate it because it's a Black person? We shouldn't do that. Wrong is wrong, ultimately. And if we're trying to raise up a new standard in our community of, the kind of men and women that are leaders, and men and women who are empowered, and men and women who are loving themselves, then we have to become a bit more critical. We can celebrate Blackness and not celebrate everybody Black.
Yeah, that's something to really think about. As we begin to talk about moving forward, I want to touch on adultification. And I want to put that in with the educational system.
Yeah.
And the structural racism that comes from that. We briefly touched on our school districts lacking resources and funding. Can we begin to talk about the other side of that, as far as how our children are treated, and then adultification, which is looking at children as if they're older than what they are, and what that leads to.
Yes. I think that has, first of all, I want to acknowledge that I recognize that, I see that playing out. At an ever increasing rate. For me, than say witnessing a Black child being brutalized by a police officer, whether in the school building itself, whether in the classroom, whether at the local park, in the community, wherever. It is both equally heartbreaking and outright angering. And again, it only seems to occur to folks of color, particularly Black folks. And I agree with you, absolutely. There's a bias that shows up in which Black children are, the white gaze upon Black children is that, well, I don't really know how old they are. I mean, personally, I don't buy it. But it has become a justification for a form of discipline that is outrightly immoral and cruel, to say the least, barbaric. And I think it's driven by, if I had to pinpoint the roots of it, I would say it originates in the penal system. When a 14, 15-year-old Black youth goes before the court wants to view that young person as an adult so that they can give them a stronger sentence. This is more to do with the objectives of the prosecutors, the judges that have political ambitions. We live in a society, a country, as we all know, that most white politicians are going to run for office, and if they're able to say that they are tough on crime, they believe they're going to be secured a block of votes from their constituents.
I was reading, just to touch on that very briefly,
Please.
I was reading, and that's exactly why some of the prisons were not releasing some of the prisoners during this health crisis, because of the stance of being tough on crime. And specifically, I was reading in New York, where the request to release some of the prisoners was denied.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, I read about that myself. But yeah, I would say that's a clear driver. The fudging the age lines, if you will, so that although the court will recognize, right, they know that the Black child's age, they're going to treat that child as an adult in the name of, well, the level of crime that was committed, when, same crime being committed by white youth, they are treated much differently. And so again, there are these levels of discrimination that add up, that are layered on top of each other. We should not see them as columns. We should see them as layers. And they compound. Each layer compounds on top of the other to the point where it creates a kind of pressure on our backs as a community that keeps us from being able to stand up so that we're able to pursue our lives the way we see fit. Again, our answer to all of this is going to be in us coming together as a community and figuring things out.
And before we go, I do want to talk about also PTSD in our communities. From the violence that occurs based upon lack of resources.
That's right.
Employment opportunities. We know that there are reasons behind the actions that we see and behaviors that we see on television when we tune into the local news. There's always reasons behind those behaviors, which we don't, well, the general public doesn't always talk about that or even is aware about what those issues are.
Yes.
And it leads into affecting our children's emotional health and adults' emotional health. I believe that being African American, the Black American experience oftentimes leads to some sort of emotional distress, particularly if you have fallen victim to racist and oppressive behaviors. Can you speak about that?
No, thank you. Once again, for those that, rely on or need studies conducted to indicate these truths, there have been a number of studies that have been done, particularly in the last 5 years, that indicate that without question, African Americans in the United States carry a level of post-traumatic stress syndrome that is the equivalent to those returning from war. And if we can appreciate that, right, then that really helps us to kind of sober up to the kind of devastating reality under which we live, that speaks to, again, why we have rates of heart disease, why we have rates of diabetes, why we have mental, emotional problems at the rate that we do. That, our ability, and see, this is where that tension shows up for me. as much as we are recognizing that all we got is ourselves, the fact of the matter is that even the most wealthy white community in this country still relies upon government for basic needs, for the provision of support systems. And so I don't want us to get caught up in this notion that somehow once we get ourselves together, we're going to figure all these things out. We're going to create the institutions that we need. I don't necessarily see that happening. But what I do see is being necessary is for us to create as much as we're able to create with the resources that we have, and at the same time, with equal portion of effort, work to hold the governments, the agencies accountable, to provide for us those services that all other communities rely upon. We should never succumb to the notion that somehow any effort in that direction is us asking for a handout, something that we don't deserve. That is a fallacy that has wreaked havoc on our mental capacity to somehow believe that unless we're able to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, something's wrong with us. That to me is a mental disorder in and of itself. Our government, they say, for the people, by the people. We are the people. In the communities in which we live, particularly those where we predominate, we are the people. And as the people, that money, whether it comes out of our income tax, whether it comes out of our property tax, wherever it comes, that money is still ours. And pulled together, electing officials that we put in the office based on our votes, those folks should be held accountable to ensure that the provisions that keep our folks healthy, safe, and have the opportunities that we need to advance in our lives are there. Yes.
I want to, when you said pull together, working with the union, what I learned is that you already know there's power in numbers, but working with the union, closely with the union, I realized you can affect change with dollars. The union is able to get things done because they have organizations that sway the government, the government, right. And that's just what it is. That's just what it is. Yes. And so I think it's important for our community to know that unless there are policy changes,
right.
We are in a country where policies are against us. Like you said, coming together, we have to come together economically so that we can, that's what's going on with our president. He is loyal to those who fund him.
Yes.
Right. He is loyal to those who fund him. And the more certain types of people fund him, the more he goes in that direction.
Right.
So it's important to know that in order for us to affect change, we have to get behind policies. We have to get behind politicians with collective economics. Also, you know, prior to or during segregation, Black communities, out of necessity, had our own communities of essential care, essential workers. We had our doctors, we had our school teachers, we had our seamstress, we had, you know, our schools, and that was out of necessity. After that, what do you think happened? I mean, there was a point in time where, as neighbors, we could knock on someone's door, or the parents would look after our children. There was a village. There was truly a village that raised a community of children. I think back to when my parents were small, listening to stories and knowing how tight-knit the community was. There has been, something has changed. And we save us, we take care of us. that is going to have to come back somehow so that we can move beyond COVID-19.
I agree. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. I would only say that I would only add the caveat that as we do that work, that we not allow ourselves to get so caught up in, say, romanticizing the past, because just honestly, I think that for every doctor, teacher we can name, we'd also be talking about 5 or 6 of us that were working on somebody's sharecropping field, and fearing, getting outright lynched, regardless of where we were in that economic scale. So, I think that the important principles that we had to develop during segregation are still relevant for us today. I would say that, I think that the point you're making is that, yes, there was a hope, perhaps an aspiration, that integration would resolve all these issues for us. And believing in the American ideal to kind of finally show up on behalf of our people. And so we've seen that, as Dr. King, someone might say, cast forward the dream, certainly he did more than dream. But we're witnessing that dream, in Malcolm's words, become a nightmare. And coming to terms with that, waking up from this miasma, if you will, of America, and coming to terms with the reality that we face. That communal principle of taking care of each other, looking after our neighbor, it's going to require us building relationships that we don't have presently in place. It's going to require us, redeveloping concepts of trust. Okay. And we're going to be better for it, right? We're going to be better for it because it's going to cause us to become accountable to each other. And we're going to be concerned about not just our children, but the children across the street. And so these things, certainly will work together for our good. But ultimately, it begins with us recognizing, one, that we are facing the greatest problem the Black community has faced in a generation right now. And again, we don't know what the outcome is going to be, but the devastation is already being wrought. The emotional toll that is being taken on families where their loved ones have died, where they can't go touch them, can't go say goodbye to them, have to, are quarantined and have to deal with all of the memories and just already being alone. This is enough to crush anybody, to make anybody to the point where they are no longer functional in our society. So we have a mighty work at hand. And, we didn't talk so much about the church institutions, and anybody who knows my work knows I've been very critical of Black churches over the years. But we're going to that's another institution that's going to have to be held accountable as well.
And that, that was part of the 9 systems that I wanted to discuss. I mean, we can touch on that if you want. Religion, the churches, that's a system
Yes.
that affects us as well. You see a lot of the evangelicals are with our president, and so it kind of makes you say, you wonder about that.
Yes.
But you are correct. I'm proud to say that I come from a place where the Black church has been involved and engaged in the civil rights movement and continuing on to today. So I'm thankful for those leaders that I've had in my life, and particularly my mom. Rest in peace. She was a social justice warrior. But there are opportunities for churches to get out on the ground,
Yes.
moving.
Yes.
And I speak about this a lot when my pastor and I have conversations, and we talk about mission, being mission based, how you have to don't start from inside the church, it's outside the church pulling in. What do you have to say about that?
On that point, I am 1,000% behind that, no question about it. And that the mission-driven churches have to be community-minded, and not just focused on those that come to the church, not be focused on getting folk into the church. We got to become the church out in the streets. We got to become the church out in the lives of people who have given up on the church for good reason in many cases. The church has been the site of sanctuary for our folks over the years. It's also been the site of abuse. It's also been the site of emotional, spiritual, and all manner of mental abuse, physical abuse. And so, yet there is still an opportunity. There is still an avenue for the church to be involved. We have to, I would say the church has to move from, and again, I know I'm not speaking about all churches, but there is, again, we're talking about narratives, we're talking about themes. There's a narrative and a theme in the Black church that kind of runs the line of, God looks out for those that pay their tithes. And if you're not paying your tithes, somehow something's wrong with you. And whatever is occurring in your life is a consequence of your lack of faith. We have to have a church that is grounded in the realities of science, that is in conversation with science, as opposed to simply believing we're going to take it all to Jesus. We can take what we can take to Jesus, but we also got to be willing to use the good sense that God gave us to make certain decisions for our lives that are beneficial for ourselves in relationship to others in our community and around this world. Our young folks, particularly those that are still in high school, they're looking at a future where they're wondering, is there still going to be a planet? And so we need a theology coming out of the church that is responsive to that call, responsive to that question. Because the evangelical church would say, oh, well, God gonna come back anyway, so it's just a matter of you getting ready to go meet God. That's no future for our children. That's walking a line that could lead many to suicide, and we know the suicide rate among Black youth is escalating right now. And so there is a lot of work for the church to do, but it's going to require mature Black men and women who have a conviction that is not dissimilar from the conviction that our ancestors had during slavery.
I think that some churches today, because of this operation like a business, I think that has taken away the original purpose of what church is. When I think about where I come from, as far as, religion, denomination, and churches, I think back to the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement pretty much was started with the Black churches. The leaders were also ministers.
Yeah.
And so I had that as a structure for myself. But the church is not doing its job when you're not directly affecting change in your members' lives. If you are not providing, if you're not extending a hand, like you said, to an entire community, not just those who you see on Sundays, but the entire community, then there's a problem. And as you said before, we don't want to go back to the past, but we can take some of those principles with us. Let's, as we move forward, when we talk about these different systems and we talk about the church, it would be good to think back to the civil rights movement and how the churches responded to that, because it was life or death back then too.
Right.
This is just a different
It's a different slice. Yes, yes.
because we are once again where it's a life or death issue.
That's right.
Whether it's in the healthcare system or right now with police brutality. Just there was a 25-year-old Ahmad, I think his name, I can't think of his Ahmad Amir, I can't think right now. Back in February, 2 ex-policemen shot this young man, sorry. It has been 2 months and there has not been any charges brought up against these 2 father and son ex-policemen. So we have to realize that we are still connected. You know, that goes back to that community, it takes a village that we had talked about. When we see these killings and we see these murders and we see all of these things that are happening to people who look like us.
That's right.
We have to know that she is me, he is you, they are we.
That's right.
It's not they, it's we.
It's we, yes.
We've been disconnected from each other.
Right.
We have upward mobility, and sometimes we turn a blind eye to what those people who haven't made it, like some of us have, and we sometimes want to say, like you said, well, I did this on my own, so they need to make it too. I made it, why can't? Well, we all have some type of help, right? We all have some type of help.
That's right.
And everyone's situation is different. Everyone needs help. And to be honest, many of us, many African Americans, stories began in some type of poverty.
Yeah.
Not all of us, not all of us.
That's right.
But a lot of us,
Yeah.
Lives were changed drastically after we attended college.
Yes.
Or after we started a business, or whatever it is that we have done has resulted in a much different lifestyle than what some of us had first starting out.
Indeed. Absolutely.
Well, this has been great. There's so much more that I want to talk about, but I know the time is, we've already been about 2 hours. I'll probably break these down, but is there anything else that you would want to share with our community? And first, I would like to say that this discussion is to highlight the structural disparities in our country, to highlight why those structural disparities exist, and that is because of white supremacy. It is not to point the fingers at individuals. It is to highlight a systemic issue in this country with policies and procedures that affect Black Americans. So this conversation was not to point a finger at white people or anyone who's not Black, but it is simply to raise, to educate and raise awareness to everyone, not just our community, because, you know, the civil rights movement, we had allies. We had allies from all sorts of people were our allies and stood and marched and fought with us. So this is to highlight why we are in the conditions that we are in. Some of us don't know why we're this way. We just blame it. Oh, it's just racism, but we don't really understand what that means. And then for those who say, oh, well, it doesn't exist. It exists.
Yes, it does.
It exists every day when, for many of us, we have to drive through others' neighborhoods to go to work, and they don't have to come through ours.
Right.
Sometimes. It exists when I'm out with some people sometimes and I can feel a look or stare and I might say something, but because they have not experienced the Black American experience, I might get told, oh, just calm down, relax, because they're not walking in my shoes.
That's right. Yeah.
So in order for us to heal as a community, in order for us to heal as a country, we have to open our ears, deprogram ourselves, deprogram our thinking, open our ears, and listen to what other people are sharing with us. Understand why people are the way they are. Understand the reasons behind behaviors, actions, and consequences.
Yeah.
And that's what this discussion was all about.
That's right. That's right. Thank you. I would, if there's one thing I would want to share, it's actually a poem.
Okay.
Part of my work is addressing institutions of authority and educating folk on the realities that we face as Black people in this country and around the world, and making those alliances. As you said, they are necessary, but it begins with us, no question. No movement has occurred that's benefited Black people that did not begin with Black people deciding now is the time, and certainly that is truth now. But yeah, I'm also a poet, and this is my latest book. It just came out just a couple, now about 2 months ago, right before the quarantine. So I'm going to read what is the title poem of the book. It's called Black Phoenix Uprising.
Okay.
And they call us magic when it's us just being who we are, scarred and Black. We resilient as sun rays. No way to comprehend it, so we name it as God. Yet, we are the holy without the ghost, the evidence of things unseen. The spirit within us has no need to haunt. Black vortex of the inexplicable, the word made flesh, enchantments of the divine. We speak in tongues, native and colonized, still conjure the force of creation like volcanoes erupting. We enunciate new worlds into being and name them all freedom, ancient as the pyramids. When we congregate, we come together not just to remember, but to resurrect the dead. We, the progeny of those that dared to be free, who've been to hell and came back smiling through bloody teeth. Black Phoenix Uprising. We are an insurrection of fire, reborn from the bone embers of our ancestors, a righteous indignation igniting revolt in the minds of the assassinated, dynamite exploding from their mouths, heat hollering past hotness, burning like the North Star. Though some of us were once tarred and feathered, we've been known to fly. Our wings spanned centuries. Talk to me of love, personified, of a million Black souls reincarnated in the backbones of our sons and daughters, their freedom dreams etched into our genes, forged from centuries of revolt, a cauldron of liquid fire poured like a shaman's rum into these charmed skins, epidermis of steel, melanated mutations, trauma alchemized to genius. Our badassness been long archived. No need for every episode to be televised, our revolution be satellite beamed from our eyes. Bright as liberation yearning, smoldering a beauty that would leave the world blind. We are root connected by the solder of Ogun, beating life from his blacksmith's hammer, are on the anvil of our hearts conjoined, bleeding like lava. No matter where in this world our Blackness is common cause, is kin that goes deeper than skin. Mood vicarious. Maybe that's the reason we often cry without knowing why, or when we deja vu in blue. Every step taken in kind, this the collective conscious of the wretched, the damnation of the yet vexed. Whatever justice there is in this world comes from the kerosene flame burning within us, comes from our conviction like the match that strikes, the match that lights, the match that ignites our will to remake this world, like we remake ourselves African again, before the English, the Spanish, the Dutch, the German, the French, and the Portuguese, before we were chained in those ships, before Leo Africanus, when what we knew ourselves to be was the genesis of humanity, that indigenous spark that will remake this world. They say we are magic, but that's just us being ourselves, scarred in black weed, resilient as the sun rising. No way to comprehend it, so we name it God.
That was beautiful. Congratulations. That was beautiful. So how can people find your books, find that poetry book? And I think you have a Who's America.
Right. Yeah, it's another book of poems. My website, it's my last name, Osayande.org.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. To end with what Ewuare was saying in his poem about humanity, I challenge everyone to, while we're still going through this health crisis, I challenge everyone to look deep within themselves and to figure out how they can change for the better. Put away the way that you were, the issues that you've had, the anger that you've had, confusion, and try to figure out a way how you can move forward as we go beyond COVID-19. Humanity is the key, and that is what is missing in society right now, in our leadership. We're missing compassion as well. We need to get back to humanity and realize that we're all in this together. When I hurt, I don't just hurt myself, but I hurt everyone else in my community hurts too. And I think that that's very important for us to move forward with. Ewuare.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have this time with you. I want to give you a shout out. The work that you're doing with the Caregiver Society is more than necessary now in these times. The help and support that you provide for those on the front lines in the hospitals and the care centers of our society, particularly those of us who are Black and brown. Thank you.
And
thank you.
And thank you for joining us today. And hopefully we'll have more discussions. You'll come back and we can talk more.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, until next time, I'm your host, Ewuare, and our guest today was Ewuare Osayande. Thank you.